Hey everyone, and welcome to the first episode of A to C of Taboos, Workplace and Beyond, where myself and my lovely co-host Sylvia are going to talk about some of the stuff that we don't usually talk about, as the title implies, in the workplace and beyond, because we've all seen the barrier between the two sort of disintegrate recently more than ever. And we wanted to dive into a number of topics, and when we thought about it in that alphabetical order, the A was a really obvious choice to go for anxiety for a variety of reasons. One of them being that Sylvia and I, being from separate sides of the planet originally and still living on separate sides of the little pond we call the Atlantic Ocean, we've still found a lot of commonality and support in each other in sharing that journey. So hopefully the tips and information we're going to share today can help some of you, and walking through the A to Z, we can share some other taboo breaking ideas. So Sylvia, welcome to our inaugural show.
I'm so excited to be here, John Thorin. Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, it's our show, so no need to thank me. Thank yourself for the collective idea that brought us here together today.
I do love that we were bantering as we often do about life and work and came up with this idea in service of others based on our own experiences of dealing with some of these issues that we struggle with uh, on our own, and now thankfully, in the context of a really great support system between each of us and around us. So I am also excited, like you said, to bring some tips and tricks to help those who are feeling very anxious right now in the midst of all the uncertainties, based on, again, our own journeys, to hopefully help people lift out of that state or have a few things that they can effectively apply to start moving forward.
Absolutely, and I think opening that discussion is such a just an important piece of that puzzle, which is why one of the first things I want to talk about is really finding the vocabulary or the language that you can use to actually express how you're feeling. So, I've dealt with anxiety for all of my life, but for the longest time, I had no idea of how to express these things I was feeling. And I remember the first time where it's just sort of, I blurted it out and said, my head feels noisy. And I know we've talked about this commonality in that section of the language where I just said that, and suddenly my boss at the time just understood, and I was like, that worked. I got it out, and I didn't die. It didn't ruin me. I got it out, and compartmentalizing that noise by externalizing it and focusing it in either conversation or even for me in music, both as a listener and a musician myself, just worked wonders for me to contain and work through my own anxiety.
I love the focus you just drove home on around building language and having words around what you're feeling, John Thor. I struggled with that for a really long time. I probably had anxiety all my life. I just didn't even know what it was, or I really didn't know how to communicate it to somebody. And how it showed up for me in the context of other people around me was I lashed out, right? I would have these outbursts or I would shut down depending on how big the anxiety was. Yet, what having language around it has done for me is to communicate and give those around me the chance to help, right? So kind of to your point about you calling it your head being noisy, I'll say something like my head is really full of thoughts that I don't know how to sort through. Or I now even have noticed that when those thoughts come together in a cacophony, it sparks the next phase, which is panic plus this sense of out of control, this all that's coupled with sadness or grief. So it's a kind of a mixture of things. And now I even can not only describe it after having practiced the language, but also to spot that I'm moving from that noisiness, that cacophony, to those big feelings, right? These very big feelings that in the past I would have just acted out on them. Now I can say, actually, I feel a sense of panic coming on. I feel very sad or out of control, and I need help to reduce that. Or sometimes I even just will tell people around me, I need to be quiet right now to cut out that noise. So having that language and communicating it has helped me to ask for help, which actually brings us to number two. Can I go ahead and jump in there?
Go for it.
Great. So the second tip that John Thor and I thought about and have talked about before many a times and want to bring to the forefront today is this idea of creating your support network and finding the right people to share these feelings, these situations with. And I'm going to break it apart into two parts in that it helps to have your support network before a situation emerges. So almost like have your hotline ready, where your phone a friend option ready to be able to then ask for that help, right? It's very hard to mentally process such big emotions like panic and anxiety and still figure out whom to call. Right? It's just a cognitive overload. At least it is for me. And in that context, as you think about pre-building your hotline or having your hotline ready, also think about who should be that hotline or part of that support outreach that you will be contacting. And I know you'll jump in here in just a moment, John Thor, with an example from your stories. For me, it was finding people that I could trust, and trust meant that they would not go and share that, potentially very vulnerable side of me with other people without permission. Uh, it was also about no judgment, so I had to go to people whom I know would be accepting of me and willing to help and knowing how to help or asking the right questions to help me pivot. And that's what right feels for me. How about for you, John Thor?
Yeah, so I think I absolutely agree with the feeling of, that right person, but I think it's also the people that are willing to show understanding and work towards actually understanding. Because I feel like the two sound the same, but they're not quite the same. Because I can show a lot of understanding for something I might never understand, but also striving to understand as much as you can. Because to your point earlier, you said sometimes you just have to say, I need to be quiet now. That's not something that someone who knows nothing about anxiety would connect to anxiety, because it shows up in so many different forms. So for me, I start spotting things like I'm overthinking things. I'm seeing signals where I shouldn't be seeing them. There's like a bit of paranoia in there. And being able to talk to my wife about it and say, I'm really feeling like something, and her knowing how to deal with that and knowing that it doesn't help to call me just paranoid, it doesn't help to sway them away, but rather to engage in the discussion. And she knows that that's what works with me.
Mhm,
And what I've found is that the more confident I've gotten in, to return to the first point, the language that I use,
mhm,
the more confident I've been to open up with more people. So I've talked about my anxiety on stage in front of a full crowd of people, not to flaunt it or anything, but because I know that at any given point there might be someone in that audience that is struggling, does not know what that support system looks like, but maybe if they get the right words, they can get that out of their heads
mhm,
and into the world around them in order to start building from something. And I just think having that vulnerability to, well, to get to really the third point, to be okay with the fact that you're not always okay. We both mentioned in the beginning that we've dealt with some parts of these problems for probably our whole lives. And just to tear that band-aid off, and I know this sounds hopeless when I say it immediately, but I don't foresee this ever going away. However, I see this becoming an easier and easier burden to deal with, if that makes sense, the more that I learn and communicate. Because I remember speaking to a therapist about this, saying that I didn't feel like my mental health had ever held me back from doing what I wanted to do, but it had often held me back from enjoying it as much as I could have. And I think because of that definition not being clear earlier, I used to minimize the seriousness of my own mental health struggles as a teenager and in my early 20s, because I thought, oh, I'm going to work, I'm showing up to school, I'm not, I haven't attempted suicide. I haven't done anything drastic to that point where I was like, well, it must not be that bad. And I think, my therapist at that time put it in such a good way where she said, A lot of people come to her saying, "Oh, I must be the most messed up person you've ever seen," or on the other side, "Oh, you must meet people that have it so much worse than I do." And she was saying it doesn't matter because the only point of reference we have is this might be the toughest thing each of us has ever dealt with, and it doesn't matter if someone else has it worse. We need to deal with our own stuff before we can start trying to help others, really.
That's such a great frame of mind to lead with whenever this situation does emerge. And I'm going to align it to my own experience in that, like you said, right, we've dealt with some parts of this all our lives, and I almost normalized it so much that I didn't really create any solutions around it, because I just thought, hey, it's like a characteristic that I was born with, right? It's just like having hair that's straight, having, 10 fingers. I literally just thought that it is what it is, and it was what it was. And yet, to your point about how it is still something that we have to deal with if we want to reach that happier state, right? That more fulfilled state. And even though it wasn't detrimental per se, or massively detrimental, it was detrimental. I just didn't think about it in those terms. It did prevent me from moving forward in a happier way, or an easier way. And this is hard. And the point that I want to make here is that once I realized that this was this anxiety, my mindset about it, the lack of solutions was a barrier to better, I then started leaning into it. And I do want to stress that, for those who are suffering from very severe anxiety, please definitely seek help, clinical and professional help. What I'm talking about here is this chronic state of anxiety that was like part of my skin. Yet I knew that if I didn't manage, if I didn't really curb some of it or move through some of it properly, I was damaging relationships, right, with people around me. I was not showing up in the way that I knew I wanted to or could. And so the solutions became more of a way to really minimize that part of me, so that other parts, the better parts or the more productive parts, could emerge a bit more fully. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, that's sort of, I think, a great point to finish on, which is don't necessarily think because someone else has problems or symptoms of whether it's anxiety, depression, whatever it is, that if you don't share that same experience, that you don't have it. It's very much worth reading up about it, whether you think you have it or not, because either it could help you figure out what you're feeling yourself, or it could help
Mhm.
you get some perspective on what others are going through. Because I think, this is the whole purpose of what we're doing here, opening up about these taboos, because I've heard so many people say things about a variety of topics that we'll touch upon. Oh, it's such a touchy subject. You can't really ask someone about it. I'd love to
Mhm.
know more, but I'm afraid to ask. And at the same time, we all have Google at our fingertips, filled with, okay, yes, a lot of misinformation and just complete crap. But if you know where to look, you can find some genuinely incredible sources of information to help educate yourself. And to your point, know where to look for professional help when you truly need it.
Yeah, and this is something we had talked about earlier, John Thor, in terms of how someone around us can help us, and how others have helped us when we have shown up with those, states of anxiety, or those big feelings, as I call them, or that noisiness in our heads. And the one thing that is very helpful that I found from those around me as part of my support network is when they show up calmly. So when they have checked themselves to come into a space that's safe and calm and gentle, I start to mirror that sense of calm, right? Or that very zenness cuts through that panic that I might be possessing or showcasing in that moment. So I just encourage, for those of you who might be right now at home with a partner, or a flatmate, who might be showing some signs of anxiety, or they've told you that they in fact are anxious, uh, really think about creating, when you enter into that space of conversation or interaction with them, creating calm, and this centeredness, almost stillness, and not feel like you have to solve anything per se, but just showing up in that caring, gentle way can help someone self guide to a calmer state than they might be in, at, in that moment.
Absolutely, because I think, as cheesy as the term has become and what a loaded term it is, you have to create a safe space for someone to just almost go down that rabbit hole, and just go down that rabbit hole with them, sort of
Mhm.
figuratively holding their hand, allowing them to talk themselves through these worries. Because what I've found is anything that I worry about in my head tends to become a smaller worry as soon as I articulate it. And it's crazy how something that feels like it's going to end the world in your head suddenly becomes, well, either A, it's just something that you don't have control over. And as difficult
Mhm.
as it is, sometimes we just have to accept our lack of control over something. Or B, it's something that we've entirely made up with a series of made up scenarios that somehow lead to a conclusion that is never going to happen.
So I laugh only because what you're saying is exactly what I do often, and I call this thing the ultimate hyperbole machine. I hyperbolize almost everything, to the point of ridicule,
Yeah.
right? To think that somehow I am the worst at something out of 7 billion people because I goofed one time. That's a hyperbole. That's
Yeah.
an exaggeration, and it's distorted fact, actually. There's not even evidence to support that I am, in fact, the worst out of 7 billion. Uh, Yet this little noggin here likes to exaggerate or hyperbolize or heighten a problem, that's, like you said, when we verbalize it externally, when we really step back and look at the evidence, there's no evidence supporting that conjured fear, even though maybe danger is real, yet that fear is very much processed here.
Absolutely. And I think an important factor to just clarify there for anyone who is in, like you said, that supporting role. This does still not mean that you come in and say, oh, that's nonsense. There's no evidence to support it. But more so guide the person through it. Ask questions in a safe way, in a calming way, but allow them to talk through it. Because if you come at it from a point of view of saying that's nonsense, there's nothing to support it, a person in the midst of anxiety will feel attacked most of the time, and either will, to your point earlier, Sylvia, lash out, or
Mhm.
they'll completely recede. And if you recede because you've had a bad experience opening up, very often it becomes increasingly difficult for that person to open up in the future.
Well, John Thor, to wrap up our segment today on anxiety, I just want to take a moment and share how it is really vulnerable to talk about something like this publicly. Certainly it is for me. Yet I think the more I talk about it, the more open I am about it and have been, the more I'm able to get support, from those around me. And I think that really underscores, at least for me personally, why I felt so called to come on here and share this message, even though it is vulnerable for me to do so with others.
Yeah, and I think, that's a big reason why I think for both of us, it was so important to do this whole alphabet series and talk about
Mhm.
these different taboos, because so many of us have grown up either being told not to talk about it, or no one's ever talked about it.
Mhm.
So we just don't have, to your point, the vocabulary. And really, that's why I hope as well the people watching will feel inclined to share their own thoughts, their own stories, maybe even tips or questions if they have some, for maybe there to be a little bit of a community around this. Maybe I'm thinking too far ahead, but I'd love to see something like that form around it. And, if you do want to be part of that community, definitely join us again for the next episode, where it's going to be B for Burnout.